Alrighty kids, in this video what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with topic 11.3 out of our Pearson Realize book, and we're going to be talking about percents that are greater than 100 and percents that are less than 1. So you're going to want to open up your book to pages 292 and 293. I will pause the video and let you get caught up. You will pause the video. Alright, let's take a look at what our Pearson book tells us. Okay, so we are talking about percents that are greater than 100 or less than 100. And it asks the question, how can you express percents that are greater than 100? So then, like always, the Pearson's a great product, and they give us a situation to deal with that help us understand the concepts. Okay, and they're talking about Jan and Kim. Jan and Kim built model cars for a science project. Kim's car traveled 140% as far as Jan's car. How can you write 140% as a fraction and as a decimal? So here's the situation. They line their cars up at the starting line, which was 0% distance. Jan's car stopped at a certain point. And so we're going to call that certain point 100%. And then what we want to do is we want to look at Kim's car and compare it to the 100% distance of Jan's car. And so what we are being told is this car traveled 140%, okay, as far as Jan's car. Okay, so obviously it went 40% farther than Jan's car. But let's talk about and look at the process for turning this into a fraction and a decimal. Okay, so the Pearson Realize book then talks a little bit more and says that a percent compares a number to 100, which we have already learned. The distance Jan's car traveled represents 100%. So the distance Jan's car traveled is 100%. Kim's car traveled 140% as far. So you have that 140% of Kim's car. Expressed as a fraction, a percent greater than 100 will always be an improper fraction. So earlier on we learned that there were three phases for going from a percent to a fraction. You had to go from a percent to a decimal to then your fraction. And so you can see where we have 140% written as an improper fraction, 140 over 100. And then we simplified it down into 7/5. Okay, and so basically all we did was we took our 140% and we thought of it as a decimal. Okay, which would be, if you move your percent symbol, turn it into a decimal, and you moved it over two places, you would end up with 1 and 40 hundredths. Okay, and so if you write that, okay, as a fraction, it would be 140 over 100, because we want an improper fraction. We don't want a mixed number. Okay, we don't want a mixed number, so we're going to have to take this 1, which represents 100, and add it to the 40. Okay, so we would have 140 over 100. Okay, so that's how we end up with an improper fraction. And then what we do is we simplify it down. And in order to do that, we would divide both amounts by 20, and we would get 5. Divide 140 by 20, and we would get 7. And so we have the improper fraction of 7/5. Okay? Now, with that in mind, we can then take a look at how they changed it into a decimal. And pretty much the same process. Okay, similarly, percents greater than 100% will always have a decimal value greater than 1. So again, we can see where we took our 140% and we wrote it as a fraction of 140 over 100, okay, or 140 hundredths, which then equals the decimal of 1 and 40 hundredths, which we then reduce down to an equivalent form of 1 and 4 tenths. All right, so you can see where 140% equals the fraction of 7/5 and the decimal of 1 and 4 tenths. All right, so anyways, let's take a look at some other examples. Okay, now in this case things get a little trickier, and you're going to want to look on your book. You're going to want to look in your book to see this problem, okay? But basically what it says is, how can you express percents less than 1? Okay, so basically what they're saying here in your book is, what percent of the total grid, okay, what percent of this total grid is the yellow shaded part of just this one square? So they took one little square and they shaded in this much of it, okay? So what we have is actually a 0.5%. And so we have 0.5% as a fraction and as a decimal. So that's what we want to write, is take 0.5% and write it as a fraction and as a decimal. And basically use what you know about the relationship among fractions, decimals, and percents to do this. And so the Pearson book does a nice job of showing you how you would write 1/2% as a decimal. It would be 5/10 of a whole percent, 1%. Okay, so you'd write it as a decimal. And so once you have that, you can then take your 5/10 of a percent and write it as 5/10 of a hundredth, because each one of these little squares is a hundredth. And then they explain to you that how you can take this fraction, and you want to remember, we want to find out what percent half of that is. So we're going to take that and change it over to thousandths, and we're going to multiply, and we will get 5 thousandths, which then gets simplified down to 1/200th, which makes sense, because if we think of it this way, all right, if we think of one square of the grid, okay, one square of the grid is 1%. So this little square is 1% of the whole grid, which is 1/100th, or as a decimal, 1/100th, okay? The yellow shaded area, however, the yellow shaded area is actually half of that 1%. Or we could write it as a fraction, and we could say it's 5/10 of a hundredth. Okay, which kind of gets confusing then. Okay, now remember, we want to find out how much this is of the overall grid. So what we have to do then is convert it to thousandths, okay? And because we want to stop working with the 5/10, we want to start working with something we can convert. And so we're going to take 5/10 and multiply it by 10, and 100 multiply 10, and we will get our 5 thousandths, okay? We create an equivalent fraction, which we can then take and turn into a simplified fraction. All right, and we would divide by 5, and we would get 1/200ths, which makes sense, because if this square has 100 squares in it, if that grid has 100 squares in it, and we divide all of those up in half, it would give us, it would double, and so instead of having 100, we would have 200 of them, and we would have just one shaded amount of the 200, so we would have 1/200th, okay? And so this is, this can get kind of confusing, but what you just want to remember is you're simply breaking things down into different amounts and different ratios. All right? So let's give a little practice and see how we do. Okay? In 8 through 19, write each percent as a fraction and as a decimal. Write fractions in simplest form. Okay, so I've just pulled 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, and 14 from your book. And what you should do is pause the video and see if you can convert these to fractions and decimals. So pause the video and solve the problems. Okay, here we go. Let's take a look at number 8. All right, so 28% written as a fraction is 7/25, and written as a decimal it is 28/100. And this is how you come up with that answer. Okay, you would take your 28% and you would rewrite it as a decimal, which would be 0 and 28/100. Okay, now once you have it as a decimal, you can then set it up as a fraction, 28 over 100. Okay, and then 28 over 100, 28/100 is not simplified, so you would divide by the greatest common factor of 4, and you would get 7. And then, of course, you're going to divide 100 by 4, and you would get 25. And so that is how they came up with these two answers. Okay, 28% became 28/100, which became the fraction 28/100, which was simplified to 7/25. All right, so let's take a look at number 9 now. Okay, number 9, they have 322% written as a fraction is a mixed number of 3 and 11/50. Written as a decimal, it is 3 and 22/100. This is how they came up with the answer for number 9. Okay, you start out with 322%. It's kind of a sloppy 322%. But we then change it into a decimal. Remember, we would move our decimal point over 3 places. And so we would have 3 and 22/100. And then if we write that as a fraction, okay, or a mixed number, it would be 3 and 22/100. And of course, because we're looking at two even numbers, we know that we need to simplify by the greatest common factor. And if we divide by 2, we will see that we get 11. And if we divide 100 by 2, we get 50. So that gives us our fraction, and then we just bring over our whole number. So 3 and 11/50. All right? And that's how they came up with that problem's answers. Okay, let's take a look at number 10 and see how you did. Okay, 54% as a fraction would be 27/50. As a decimal, it would be 54/100. And this is how they solved this problem. Okay, we started out with 54%. And what we want to do is we want to turn that into a decimal. So we would have 54/100. And then 54/100 as a fraction would be 54 over 100, because it's 54/100. And then we divide both of those by the greatest common factor of 2, and we would get 27. And we would get 50. So we would have 27/50, and that's how they came up with 27/50. All right? The next problem would be problem number 12. And problem number 12, the fraction is 18/25, and the decimal is 72/100. And the way they came up with that, they took 72%, and of course we're following this same pattern here where we go from a percent to a decimal to a fraction. And so this would be 72/100 as a decimal. And then as we write it as a fraction, it would be 72 over 100. And if we simplify that, we will divide by the greatest common factor of 4, and we will get 18. 72 divided by 4 is 18, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. And so that's how we came up with our 18/25 and our 72/100. All right, problem number 13 is another big problem, more than 100%, and the percent we're working with is 555%, which sometimes sounds kind of weird, but all we have to do is remember that we're going to write it as a decimal. Our decimal comes over 2 places to the left, so it would be 5 and 55 hundredths. And then if we were to write that as a mixed number, you would see that we get 5 and 55 hundredths. And of course, we're going to want to simplify our fraction, so we're going to divide by the greatest common factor of 5, and 55 divided by 5 is 11, and 100 divided by 5 is 20, and then we bring over our 5, so we will have 5 and 11/20. And the book, the Pearson people tell us that we will have 5 and 11/20 and 5 and 55 hundredths. All right, so our last problem is problem 14. And problem 14, they want you to take 90% and write it as the fraction, and it would be 9/10. And then the decimal would be 90 hundredths. And again, the way you get that is you start out with your 90%, and you turn it into a fraction, which would be 90 over 100. And what we want to do then, whoops, forgot my decimal there. Well, that's all right. We can still go ahead and do this. Okay. If we simplify that, we're going to divide by 10, which would give us 9 over 10, because we're going to divide both by 10. So we get 9/10. And then, of course, if you have 9/10, you can easily convert it to 90 hundredths. Okay? So we would have the equivalent of 90 hundredths. Okay? And so there you go. That's how you would convert those. All right? Hopefully you did a good job. And if you have any questions, you can see your teacher, or you can get some help from your parents.